Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Merricks Garage. New videos coming every Friday to you guys. Today we are getting into the coilover. I gave you a precursory high overview a couple weeks back. Today we're going to talk about primary and secondary springs, how to calculate their rates, internal versus external bypass, fluid dynamics, how bump stops work, what a shock absorber is really there to do, a whole ton of stuff. I know it's going to be helpful to you guys. Hopefully I can make it entertaining. Let's go see. When talking about the coilover shock, it's important to understand the purposes of each part of the system and what they are responsible for. There often seems to be some confusion as to what a shock really does. In this instance, in this application, the shock's job is to control changes in shaft velocity. This being your shaft, as it moves up from input from the terrain, the shaft velocity is going to change dependent on how severe the hit is. The more severe the hit, like hitting a big boulder, is going to be a high shaft velocity. A low shaft velocity will be caused by just like pavement cracks and washboard and things like that. You have compression dampening and rebound dampening. Both of these are handled through a piston, which is at the end of this shaft. Within that piston, think of it as a dividing wall between areas of high pressure and low pressure. When you have stasis in the shock, meaning there is no inputs, you have an equal pressure between the upper and lower compartments of the shock on either side of that piston. As the piston moves up on a compression cycle, you are going to create an area of high pressure above the valve piston that's going to push fluid through the valve body to the lower reservoir or lower area of the shock below the piston. You can control how quickly fluid moves through the system, through the piston, by introducing different shim stacks or valve plates. I've heard them referred to a lot of things, but they're essentially a flat disc that goes, in the case of compression dampening, it's going to go underneath the piston to control the speed in which the fluid moves through the bleed holes in the piston itself. You can change the thickness of these things and how many you run, and essentially hydraulic force pushing the fluid from an area of high pressure to low pressure is going to allow the fluid to move past that disc by slightly bending and opening it. Okay, so we have a basic understanding of the characteristics and job of the dampener. To dampen motion. Most of the times in this application it's going to be compressive motion, but you can get in instances that you can adjust the rebound dampening too. But for the sake of argument, we're not going to discuss that today. Let's talk about the springs. You'll notice that there is 2 springs on this shock. Some get up to about 3 springs too. By running 2 springs, you get the added benefit of having a combined functional spring rate and then a different spring rate at different stages of the suspension cycle. When we start talking about spring rate, if you've got a 300-pound spring, it's going to travel 1 inch for every 300 pounds of input force it's received. So at 900 pounds, it's going to travel 3 inches. Where this gets confusing is if you have a 200-pound and a 300-pound spring, the effective spring rate is not going to be 500 pounds. It's going to be an algorithm of various factors that we're going to get into in a minute. But suffice it to say, you have a selection of springs that you can play around with. You're not constrained to, like leaf springs, to the spring rate that it comes with. You can swap and mix and match these springs to your heart's content. So when you have this dual spring rate, you have this slider separating the primary spring and the secondary spring. As the shock moves through its compressive cycle and you have the shaft going up into the valve body and displacing fluid, you will have this spring divider moving up until it comes in contact with these spring nuts. These spring nuts can be located anywhere along the threaded valve body that you want. The purpose of these is to transition from a dual spring effective rate to a secondary spring effective rate, meaning that as this travels up, once it hits the top lock nut, the only part of the spring system that is going to be getting compressed is going to be the secondary bottom rate spring. This enables you to have two different ride characteristics: a softer, more supple ride for the low shaft frequency and low input shaft velocities. And then when you do encounter a big hit that moves beyond that initial compressive velocity, you transition over to a secondary spring, generally of a higher rate. So now that we have our understanding of springs down, let's get into how you calculate what springs you're going to use for your vehicle. There's tons of calculators online. I'll link to some in the description down below, but you can go as detailed or as high level as you want with this. I wanted to get a really quick, rough approximation of the number I wanted to get, and as a result, I did the time-tested and proven way of weighing my truck, anticipating how much sag I wanted, and calculating that out into what spring rate would accommodate that. You kind of get where you want to be and work backwards. So I'm going to break out the whiteboard here so you guys can take a look at this. It's not that complicated, but it does require some math. So I'm already freaked out.
But what we have to figure out is how much sag are we going to run in the shock, and correspondingly, what spring will give us that sag amount. So there's a formula that you've got to run it through, and you can get very complicated. This is a high level, just giving me a basic understanding of what spring rates to start off with. First thing to do is to go get your vehicle weighed. You're gonna need to know roughly how much it weighs and what that distribution of weight is. I went to my local dump and they have a scale that you weigh yourself coming in and going out. So I did a dry weight with me in it, and then I did a dry weight when I was leaving on the front axles and then the rear axles. After I knew what my truck weighed at each end, I had to subtract out all the unsprung weight. The unsprung weight is going to be my wheels and tires, the brakes, the axle, anything that isn't going to be suspended by the coilover. So after doing all those numbers, I had 3,080 pounds for the front of the truck, minus 305 pounds for the axle, 135 pounds for each of the tires, divided by 2, got me an effective corner weight of 1,250 pounds. In the rear, I had 3,440, minus the axle, minus the tires, got me down, divided by 2, got me down to 1,350. Now I found it easiest when doing the math to pick a spring rate and work backwards, meaning that if I plugged some numbers into the formula, that would tell me how much compression or sag I was going to see when I put those springs on the coilovers. So here's the final numbers. This is the formula to essentially get your effective spring rate. So the combination of my 250 pound primary spring, 300 pound secondary spring gets me an effective spring rate of 145 pounds, meaning that it's going to take 145 pounds of force to move that spring or compress the joint tension of springs 1 inch. For the rear springs, I'm running a primary and secondary at the same rate. I'm bumping up to 350 for the rear. That gets me an effective spring rate of 175 pounds. So with 1,250 pounds on each corner, with an effective spring rate of 145 pounds, is going to see me sagging about 8.5 inches. 1,350 pounds per corner with an effective spring rate of 175 is going to get me down to about 8 inches of sag. Why does all this matter? Why don't you just put the stiffest springs on there? Then you will be able to accommodate any kind of hit that comes your way. Well, ride quality would be absolutely terrible. The purpose of a shock is to isolate the vehicle from any imperfection in the road surface. The purpose of the suspension is to keep the wheel tracking on the terrain. You do not really want your suspension to be keeping you bouncing off the terrain. You want it to keep you on the terrain. So as much as you will have imperfections that rise up from the terrain like a rock or a root or a washboard, you're going to have depressions, negatives, where the ground will fall away from the wheel, and it is the job of the coilover to push that wheel down to gain traction. You have traction and control as long as your wheels are on the ground. It is the job of a well sorted out suspension to make sure that that happens as much as it can. So that's why sag is important. You do not want to set up your shock so that you are running a full 14 inches of sag, because that is going to set you up for a horrible ride and probably stress your components significantly. I find that a good number is about 50% sag. With the numbers that I gave you a few minutes ago, the 8.5 and the 7.5 or 8 and 7, that's going to run me roughly right in the middle of my suspension stroke, leaving me 7 inches of compression and roughly 7 inches of extension. With those two, my shock should be cycling in the middle of its happy place. I will have the bump stops to alleviate any hard bottoming out should I encounter that. I really hope I didn't lose a lot of you here. I can look at my YouTube analytics and see if this just did a big crater when I started talking math. But unfortunately, when you get into linkages, coilover, suspension rates, valving, there's a lot of math involved. There's formulas and calculators and spreadsheets that you can use. But with some basic whiteboard and a little calculator, you can do a lot of it yourself.
And there we have this week's episode of Merricks Garage. Thank you so very much for watching. I know there's some stuff I didn't have a chance to get into. The video just kept on going, and I realized, like, man, I don't have enough time to cover all this. So there will be subsequent episodes where we talk about the bypass and cavitation and things like that. But for the time being, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. As always, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and check the comments down below. I guarantee I probably messed up on some things, and my trusty viewers will come in and keep me honest. So if there's something that seemed a little strange, look down below, and I will probably be corrected in the comments before this even hits 100 views. So thank you guys for watching. I will see you next week. Merricks Garage.